$5. That's what 2 clay pots and a bag of sand cost at any garden center in the country. And with nothing more than that, no wiring, no compressor, no monthly bill, the Amish have kept food cold and rooms bearable through July and August for longer than your power company has existed. You'd think something that cheap and that simple would be on the front page of every newspaper. Instead, it sits in a strange gray zone where building codes, housing regulations, and health inspectors have quietly made sure most Americans never try it. Not because it's dangerous, because it doesn't require a meter. If you're the kind of person who's always suspected that the old ways worked better than anyone in charge wants to admit, you're in the right place. And if this makes sense to you by the end, pass it along to someone who's tired of writing checks to the utility company every month. That's how this kind of knowledge stays alive. There's a number most people don't think about until it hits them in the gut. The average American household spends somewhere between $400 and $600 every summer just on cooling. That's air conditioning. That's the refrigerator humming around the clock. That's the fan running in every room because the AC can't quite keep up. Add it up over a decade and you're looking at thousands of dollars just to stay comfortable in your own home. And every single dollar of that goes to a utility company that has zero interest in telling you there's another way. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a business model. They sell electricity, you buy it. Simple as that. But what if the buying part was always more optional than they let on? Here's what gets me about the Amish. They didn't reject modern cooling because they're stubborn or backward. That's the lazy explanation people reach for when they don't understand the logic. They rejected dependency. There's a difference. An Amish household in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, gets through the same humid summer that has their English neighbors cranking the AC to 68, and they do it without a single kilowatt from the grid. Not because they enjoy sweating, because they kept using principles that the rest of us were slowly, quietly trained to forget. Principles that run on physics, not on a power bill. And the physics haven't changed in 1,000 years. The sales pitch is the only thing that changed. Let's slow down for a second because this is where most people get tripped up. When you hear the word cooling, your brain goes straight to a machine, a compressor, refrigerant, coils, a thermostat on the wall. That's the modern picture. But cooling isn't a machine. Cooling is a process. Heat moves. It moves from hot things to cold things, always without being asked. And when water evaporates, off a surface, off a cloth, off wet sand, it pulls heat with it as it goes. That's not a trick. That's thermodynamics. You already know this in your bones. You felt it every time you stepped out of a pool on a breezy day and got goosebumps in 90-degree weather. Your body was being cooled by evaporation. No electricity required, no monthly subscription. The Amish didn't invent this. Neither did anyone else alive today. Evaporative cooling and thermal mass storage go back thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians used porous clay jars to chill water in the desert. Persians built wind towers that pulled hot air through underground channels and sent it back up cool. Nigerian families in rural villages still use a device called a zir pot, 2 clay pots nested together with wet sand between them to keep vegetables fresh for weeks without power. The Amish simply belong to a long global tradition of people who never let anyone convince them that you need a machine to do what dirt and water already do for free. Now here's the turn that most videos on this topic won't give you, and it's the part that matters most. These methods aren't obscure because they failed. They're obscure because they're economically inconvenient for the people who sell you the alternative. Think about it from the other side of the counter. If you're a utility company, a home builder working to code, or a manufacturer of refrigeration equipment, what's your worst nightmare? A customer who doesn't need you. A family that figured out how to keep their food cold and their house cool with $5 worth of clay and some well-placed shade. You can't bill that household monthly. You can't sell them a maintenance plan. They've stepped outside your entire revenue model, and that makes them a problem. This is where the illegal part of the title earns its quotation marks. Nobody's going to arrest you for putting 2 clay pots together. But across dozens of jurisdictions in the United States, regulations have been written, sometimes deliberately, sometimes as side effects, that make off-grid cooling and food storage practices either non-compliant or outright prohibited in certain contexts. There are counties where living without a grid connection violates occupancy codes. Cities where a root cellar has to meet commercial refrigeration standards to be considered safe food storage. HOA agreements that ban evaporative setups as unsightly structures. The pattern is consistent. Anything that works without the system gets treated as a code violation rather than a solution. And this isn't just cooling. You've probably heard the rainwater collection stories, states where catching rain off your own roof was technically restricted for years, or composting toilet bans in areas where municipal sewer hookups are mandatory, regardless of whether your system works fine on its own. The regulatory web around self-reliance is real, it's documented, and it almost always serves the same function. It keeps you inside the system that charges you. That's not to say every code is corrupt. Some exist for genuine safety reasons. But when a clay pot full of sand gets treated with the same regulatory suspicion as an unlicensed electrical installation, something has gone sideways in the priorities. So here's where we stand. You've got a set of cooling principles that are older than any government, backed by physics that a 5th grader can understand, used by millions of people across history, and still used by Amish communities today. And you've got a regulatory and commercial framework that has slowly, methodically nudged those principles out of mainstream practice, not because they stopped working, but because they stopped generating revenue. The question that should be forming in your mind right now isn't whether this works. It's how it works in practice. What you can build this weekend for pocket change, and where the honest limits are. Because there are limits. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. That's exactly what we're getting into next. Let's start with the one that earns the title's $5 claim on its own, the Zier pot, sometimes called the pot-in-pot cooler. You need 2 unglazed terracotta pots, one small enough to fit inside the other with a gap of about an inch or 2 all the way around. You need clean sand to fill that gap. You need water to soak the sand. And you need a damp cloth or towel to cover the top. That's the whole build. No moving parts, no wiring, no instructions that require a YouTube tutorial to decode. You set the small pot inside the large one, pack wet sand into the space between them, put your produce or leftovers inside the inner pot, Drape the wet cloth over the top and set it somewhere with decent airflow, a shaded porch, an open window, a breezeway. Total cost at a garden center or thrift store, $3 to $5. Here's what happens inside that simple setup and why it genuinely works. The unglazed clay is porous. It lets moisture seep through slowly. The wet sand between the two pots acts as an evaporative layer. As air moves across the outer pot, that moisture evaporates, and evaporation is an energy-hungry process. It pulls heat away from the inner pot to fuel itself. The result is a measurable temperature drop inside the smaller pot, typically 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit below the surrounding air in dry conditions. That's not a guess. That's been tested and documented in field studies from Nigeria to Arizona. Your tomatoes, peppers, greens, and herbs sit in that cooler pocket and last days longer than they would on a countertop. In arid climates, the effect is even more pronounced. Now, the room cooling side of the title, and this is where Amish households really show what a few centuries of accumulated common sense can do. Walk into a traditional Amish home in summer, and the first thing you notice is the temperature difference. Thick walls, stone, brick, sometimes earthen construction, absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, which means the inside stays cool well into the afternoon even as the outside air climbs. Small windows on the sun-facing side, larger windows on the shaded side, positioned to catch cross breezes. Deep roof overhangs that keep direct sun off the walls, and in some homes a root cellar or spring house that acts as a natural cold sink underneath or beside the house, feeding cooler air up through the living space. None of this costs anything to run. All of it was designed with one principle in mind: work with heat movement instead of fighting it with a machine. You probably don't have stone walls and a spring house. That's fine. The same principle scales down to almost nothing. Here's the simplest version. Take a bed sheet, soak it in cool water, wring it out so it's damp but not dripping, and hang it across an open window where you've got air moving through. That's an evaporative curtain. The breeze passes through the wet fabric, loses heat to evaporation, and enters your room noticeably cooler. Cost, $0, assuming you own a sheet. The slightly more involved version: set a shallow pan of water or a tray of ice in front of a box fan. The fan blows air across the cold surface, picks up that cooler temperature, and circulates it through the room. That's a simplified swamp cooler. People in the desert Southwest have used variations of this for as long as fans have existed, and before fans, they used wind scoops and wet burlap over doorways. Here's the part I won't skip, because skipping it is what separates honest advice from clickbait. These methods have real limits, and pretending they don't would be doing you a disservice. The Zier pot works beautifully in dry heat. New Mexico, West Texas, the high plains, anywhere humidity stays low. But in the deep south, where August air is already soaked with moisture, evaporation slows to a crawl and the cooling effect drops significantly. A Zier pot in Mississippi humidity might give you a 5-degree drop instead of 20. Still something, but not enough to keep perishable meat safe for days. Similarly, the wet sheet trick is most effective when the air outside is hot and dry. In muggy, still conditions, a damp curtain just makes the room feel swampy without much actual cooling. Climate matters. Conditions matter. Airflow matters.
And food safety deserves its own honest moment here. A Zir pot can extend the life of fruits, vegetables, and some dairy products meaningfully, but it is not a refrigerator. It does not hold a steady 38 degrees. For raw meat, for anything that needs to stay below 40 degrees consistently to be safe, you need actual refrigeration or same-day use. The Amish themselves know this. Their communities historically used ice houses, spring houses with running cold water, and community cold storage arrangements for meat and dairy, not a single clay pot. They combined methods, layered strategies, and planned their food cycles around what each technique could and couldn't handle. The honest version of this story isn't throw away your fridge. It's stop paying to cool things that never needed a fridge in the first place. And that's a bigger list than most people realize.
So let's put the title's 3 promises to rest one by one. The $5, that's the Zir pot, and that price is real. 2 terracotta pots, sand, water. You can source it for under $5 at any garden center, dollar store, or thrift shop, and the build takes 10 minutes. The forever, that's the principle, not the pot. Clay cracks. Sand dries out and gets refreshed, but the physics behind it never wears out, never needs a software update, never requires a replacement part you can't find. As long as there's clay, water, and moving air, the mechanism works. And the illegal, that's the quotation marks doing honest work. Nobody's breaking down your door over a clay pot. But the broader system of codes, regulations, and commercial assumptions that steers you away from self-reliant cooling is real, documented, and worth understanding, so you know where you actually stand in your own county. Here's what I'd ask you to do. Not 5 things, just 1. This week, get 2 clay pots. Doesn't matter if they're pretty. Fill the gap with sand, wet it down, put a few tomatoes inside, cover the top with a damp cloth, and set it in the shade where there's a little breeze. Check those tomatoes in 3 days. Compare them to the ones sitting on your kitchen counter. You won't need me or anyone else to tell you what happened. You'll see it with your own hands. That's the thing about old knowledge. It doesn't ask you to believe, it asks you to try. And once you've tried it, no utility bill, no building code, and no corporation's marketing department can convince you it doesn't work. We were told that progress means more expensive, more complicated, more dependent. The Amish looked at that deal and said no. Maybe they had a point. If you think more people ought to hear that, you already know what to do.